All right, welcome back. We're about to dive into renewable energy in cities. One of the biggest questions that we need to dive into when we are talking about cities and energy policies is are net zero cities really net zero? What does this actually mean? Net zero emissions are defined as the following: carbon dioxide, CO2, or greenhouse gases, GHG emissions, are equal to the carbon dioxide, CO2, or greenhouse gas, GHG removal. So this is very simple: emissions equal removal. If those things are equal, we can call it net zero emissions. Now, this means that net zero emissions does not mean zero emissions. It is different than, say, a gross zero target, which would involve a complete elimination of emissions. Such an absolute target is not realistic with highly industrialized and rapidly industrializing economies in the world. The goal, thus, is to achieve emissions neutrally or net zero emissions by emitting less and absorbing more. It's also important to note that not all countries may be able to achieve net zero in the same time frame. Some are further along in their decarbonization journeys and will be able to achieve net zero sooner than others, which are facing complete challenges like poverty and energy security. While every country has the responsibility to contribute to the global net zero goal, what each country is able to commit right now might vastly differ. Energy use is responsible for about 73% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So reducing energy demand by making energy systems more efficient and switching away from fossil fuels to renewable energy are effective ways to reduce emissions. Nature-based solutions can absorb emission to some extent, such as green spaces, installation of green spaces, but there are planetary limits preventing them from being reliable ways to eliminate emissions altogether. Technologies that remove carbon from the atmosphere exist, but these are not yet commercially viable, and there's currently no technologies that can remove other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in a similar way. Thus, while absorption and removal could play some role in the longer term, energy efficiency and renewable energy are currently the most direct, feasible, and effective paths to net zero. I'm going to show you some examples of renewable energy transitions in Latin America so that you can get an idea of the range of policies or approaches that cities might use in trying to reach a net zero emissions goal. So first up here is Mexico City. Mexico City has developed its ambitious and innovative solar energy program to shift to renewable energy while creating local economic development and jobs. The program is expected to generate 10,700 jobs in Mexico City and has a budget of around 610 USD million, which is about 33 million USD will come from the city's public fund, and the rest is going to come from international development banks and other sources. The Solar City program includes installation of solar water heating sources in businesses and households, as well as scaling up solar panels on both public buildings and small and medium enterprises with a combined capacity of 350 megawatts. In addition, the initiative plans on training 1,000 technicians for the installation of solar systems, retrofitting public buildings, promoting waste to energy products for biogas production, and increasing collection of used oil by 15% per year to ramp up the collection of biodiesel. So these are, this is one example here that's really going to heavily lean on both solar power, but also biogas, and is working to retrofit public buildings to actually reduce the amount of emissions coming from buildings in the first place, and also reducing the energy emissions, so the amount of energy produced, making that more efficient energy. So that way, not only are you able to replace more of the energy with a more sustainable, renewable source of energy, but it actually requires less energy to run in the first place. Another great example is Palmas in Brazil. So Palmas has a goal to generate 100% of its local electricity supply based on solar panels by 2035, and has been working to get its household and companies to be part of this journey. This commitment is driven by the desire to reduce the city's dependence on the regional grid, reduce energy bills, and improve local air quality. The city's introduced a tax incentive to encourage companies and households to install solar panels and feed surplus generation to the grid. Users are encouraged to install solar panels in exchange for a discount of up to 80% on 2 municipal taxes for a period of 5 years. And the city has financed this by launching a project right after a tax increase, foreseeing that a share of the municipal revenue would be allocated to this project. So in this example here, we see that there is a tax incentive built into this, that they're incentivizing this through providing monetary incentives at the municipal tax level. And they're smartly doing this right after a municipal tax increase. So that way they already had this planned for tax revenue increases for other projects in the city as well, and built this in as part of their tax revenue increase plan. Recife in Brazil is one of the first in the country to formally declare a climate emergency. In response to this, the city has committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2050, with an intermediate target of achieving 100% renewable in citywide operations by 2037. As part of this plan, the city created a municipal forum to formulate climate change and sustainability policies. And as part of this, to promote greater citizen and resident participation, the city, in collaboration with other local energy companies, holds public meetings where it presents future plans and the results of the projects in the region. So one thing that's really interesting about this particular case study is not only do they have clear, measurable renewable energy sources and target goals for carbon neutrality and also these renewable energy sourcings, but they're also trying to actively engage citizens and residents in municipal forums and meetings, and also making sure that they are bringing local energy companies to the table as well, so that there is direct dialogue between the energy companies and the citizens and residents of the city. However, we need to watch out for these two things. It is definitely a trap when we start getting into companies or cities that are using carbon offsets. And we need to be really mindful about how emissions tracking is actually being carried out at the city level. The purchase of carbon offsets is a really popular way to achieve a net zero or a net emissions goal. In a nutshell, this basically involves paying for a project that reduces emissions anywhere in the world to compensate for a particular polluting activity. Whoever purchases the offset gets to claim the credit for reducing carbon emissions without actually having to do so. Relying on offsets could thus render net zero targets meaningless and allow rich countries to decarbonize at the expense of poorer ones. A really popular example of this is that now often when you go and buy airline miles or like an airplane ticket, you're oftentimes like conferences that you're going to, or the airline itself may say, oh, do you want to offset your trip? And so basically what you'll do is you'll purchase, let's say, $10, and then the company will go and purchase carbon offset credits to be able to claim that, X number of flights were carbon neutral this year. There are some nuances to this in that if you are really committed to carbon offsetting, and this is something that you really want to look into, there are options for carbon offsetting that cause the creation of new projects. But oftentimes the carbon offsets are existing projects that are going to happen regardless of whether you purchase that credit or not. So the purchasing of carbon offsets is more of like a pat on the back, feel good activity rather than something that truly, actually helps with mitigation efforts. Additionally, the ways that countries are tracking their emissions leaves a lot to be desired. Emissions are tracked on a territorial basis, meaning that net zero targets are only concerned with emissions produced within a particular jurisdiction or on that territory. This method obviously leaves out the emissions arising from the products or services consumed in the territory, but produced elsewhere. So the shipping and aviation industries, which are significant contributors to global emissions, are also excluded from such accounting. This also paves the way for cross-border carbon leakage, through which countries can simply reallocate their polluting activities to other jurisdictions where environmental standards are lower without having to take ownership for resulting emissions. In effect, the production-based accounting method leaves a significant proportion of the emissions unaccounted for. Areas where we need to be careful about this at the city level include things like airports. Oftentimes, airports are not included in what the city uses to calculate its emissions levels. So for example, if we were to chop off the Salt Lake City airport, that the airport is going to have a much different level of emissions that it is producing versus the rest of Salt Lake City. So it's really important to know where the incorporations are within your city's boundaries and what actually goes into the formula to calculate the emissions for your city. Many cities have been strategically breaking off parts of its city, or if they know that there's like large industrial areas, they will kind of draw little lines around where they're calculating emissions on this. And so we need to have our spidey senses on the lookout and pay very particular attention to what is being fed into the formula to know what the emissions level being calculated is. Furthermore, cities are the ones that are responsible for reporting their emissions levels. There is no independent entity or body at an international level, at a national level, at any level that is acting as an independent authority to calculate these emissions levels. And so cities are essentially in charge of calculating all of this themselves. And they're the ones that are in charge of making that data and information available, and it's completely voluntary at this point. So we do need to be careful when you're looking at both of those things. We can also think about alternative tracking methods when we're talking about the emissions problem in particular. There's 3 different alternative tracking methods that different researchers and activists are looking into. So there's a consumption-based, a border tax, and an ownership-based alternative tracking method. A more comprehensive accounting of global emissions can be achieved through a combination of these methods. A consumption-based approach accounts for emissions embodied in the goods and the services consumed within a territory. This would cover all emissions imported through international trade, including those arising from the transit of internationally traded goods through shipping and aviation. However, the consumption-based method is far more difficult for countries to track and influence than their territorial emissions, so they tend to favor the production-based methods. This is also a really good one to keep in mind too when we think about some of the cities that are like leaders in these. So for example, the Bay Area, New York, while internally they might be able to claim that there's not a lot of production of these things happening in the city, they are importing and consuming a lot of goods, which means they are contributing from emissions pretty substantially from a comprehensive accounting used on a consumption-based approach method. Also, they also export a lot of things like their recycling or waste, which those calculations are also done based off of a territorial piece. So if you were exporting your waste somewhere out, either out of the city or out of the state for consumption or processing, it means that that doesn't factor into your waste numbers as a city. Also, it's good to keep in mind that there are places like the EU that does not use a consumption-based accounting method, but has acknowledged the need to reduce the carbon footprint of products consumed within the region. The EU's proposed a carbon border adjustment mechanism, often referred to as a border tax, to discourage the consumption of foreign products and services that have high carbon footprints. However, this proposed mechanisms raise some questions of equity and fairness towards emerging economies and seems unlikely to be adopted unless reformed to account for those equity issues. Third, there's another emissions accounting approach called ownership-based. Recommended by researchers studying Chinese overseas coal finance, the principle behind this is that emissions arising from all goods and services owned by a country should count towards its national emissions balance, irrespective of where they're located. Per this principle, countries like China, Japan, South Korea would need to stop engaging in cross-border carbon leakage. So for example, investing in fossil fuels overseas in order to achieve their net zero targets, unless of course they purchase carbon offsets. So as you can see, the method of tracking emissions in the first place creates a lot of possible ways where things can go rogue, and greenwashing can really easily be added to the mix here. And so we do have to be really careful in thinking about how emissions are calculated, and also considering how can we blend different emissions tracking methods in order to get a true picture of where issues with emissions production is happening. So is net zero carbon emissions good policy? Well, let's consider a couple of pieces on this. Is the policy based on data? Well, your city's policy might be based on data. You'll want to consider whether the target that's being set has actually used several years of city data on emissions. You'll want to consider how those emissions were calculated and whether the policy is aligned to reducing emissions as they are calculated. For example, if your city uses a territorial calculation for it, and you don't see any policies that are addressing possible consumption-based or ownership-based carbon emissions, it might not be a good policy. It might be more on the greenwashing side. We also want to consider, too, a variety of stakeholders consulted in this and involved in the implementation. So, for example, if your city has declared a net zero carbon emission policy, but the only action items on there are for government-owned properties or offices, there's no engagement with local business owners, there's no engagement with local school boards, there's no engagement with residential areas, neighborhood groups, it's probably more of a greenwashing policy and not necessarily a good policy, because it means that a lot of stakeholders are going to continue to be causing emissions within the city. And the city is really only making an attempt to change the things it has direct control over, like its office buildings. It's also important to think about whether the policy is funded or resourced in some way. So, for example, if your city declares a net zero carbon emission policy, and it is, let's, for example, say, engaging with residential groups, let's consider that, for example, in low-income neighborhoods, folks may not have access to money that would allow them to convert their sourcing of power to solar panels, right? So does the city make, for example, solar panel purchasing more accessible to low-income communities? Does it allow renters to access solar panel solar panel energy sourcing? Does it actually address the underlying concerns that people may have about reliable sourcing of energy if they switch to renewables? Are there public outreach efforts in this, and is there money to fund those outreach efforts, or are they relying solely on volunteer labor? And then finally, is there a plan to evaluate effectiveness of the policy during and after implementation? So is your city going to be tracking their emissions every quarter, every year? Are they going to be producing public reports of where they're at in those emissions goals? Will they make adjustments to their policy if they're behind their net zero carbon emissions goals? Are they actually going to be measuring the effects that certain policies have when they implement them on emissions reduction, or are they not going to assess this for another 10 years? Those are all really important ways to assess whether a zero carbon emissions policy is actually good policy or whether your city is trying to just get some greenwashing points. Next, we're going to talk about transportation and housing. Feel free to go ahead and take a little break before we begin.